So picture this. You spend months architecting a distributed system. I mean, you are staying up until 3 in the morning debugging race conditions.
Oh, yeah, the classic late-night debugging session.
Right. And you finally deploy this database schema that can handle, I don't know, millions of concurrent requests without dropping a single packet.
Which is a huge achievement.
It totally is. It's a masterpiece of logic and efficiency.
Yeah.
But then, you have to build a user interface for it so your team can actually use the thing.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just sitting there.
Exactly. So you wire it up, the data flows perfectly, and you proudly show it to a colleague. And they give you this polite, slightly pained smile. And they just say, wow, it really looks like it was built by an engineer.
Yeah, which is just the polite corporate translation for this looks like a cardboard box held together with duct tape.
Right.
It is honestly never a compliment.
It is brutal. I mean, the engine under the hood is a Ferrari, but nobody trusts the Ferrari if the steering wheel is made of, like, rusty wire.
Really don't.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to decode the seemingly mystical art of design and, turn it into concrete, systematic logic.
Which I think is going to be super helpful for a lot of people listening.
Totally. We are pulling our insights from a breakdown specifically targeted at technical minds. It's an excerpt from Chapter 1, Design Rules for Engineers' Hierarchy and Whitespace.
It's a great piece of source material.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
The core thesis we are looking at here is that design is not art. It is not about having some innate sense of taste or this magical eye for aesthetics.
Right. It is fundamentally a problem-solving discipline. I mean, there is this pervasive myth in the tech world that designers are just, born with a paintbrush in their hand.
Yeah, like they just feel their way to a good interface.
Exactly, through pure intuition or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you look at Apple's website or, say, Stripe's documentation or just any truly world-class interface,
Yeah.
you are not looking at raw, unbridled creativity.
No, not at all.
You are looking at applied knowledge. You're looking at a strict set of principles, patterns, and rules that have been executed with, honestly, mathematical consistency.
Which means it is a toolkit. And if you can learn system design or, how to traverse a binary tree, you can absolutely learn this toolkit.
100%.
And to illustrate how we actually acquire these rules, there is this incredibly accurate mental model in the text that we need to look at. Think back to when you first started programming.
Oh, boy.
Right? Maybe you were a junior engineer or just scripting for the very first time. Your code technically executed. Like the compiler accepted it.
It ran somehow.
It ran. But if we looked at the actual files, you were probably writing like 2,000-line God-class functions. Your variables were named wildly inconsistent things. You had zero separation of concerns.
Yeah, the code was basically just a wall of spaghetti logic.
Exactly.
It functioned, sure, but it was hostile to any human being who actually had to read it or maintain it later. It placed an enormous cognitive load on the next developer.
Which is exactly the same way a bad user interface places a massive cognitive load on the user.
Right.
When you were that junior dev, you didn't suddenly become an artist of code to get better. You didn't, go to a retreat in the woods to find your coding muse.
No, you just learn the rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You learned the single responsibility principle. You learned dependency injection. You learned how to modularize your logic so the human brain could actually parse it.
Right. You got better because you applied systematic rules to your raw logic.
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychological relief this concept offers to analytical thinkers.
Oh, totally. Because the gap between an interface that merely functions and one that looks incredibly professional, it isn't some unbridgeable chasm.
Right. You don't need a fine arts degree.
Exactly. You do not have to enroll in an art academy for 4 years to cross it. The reality is that this gap consists of about 15 specific, highly mechanical things.
It's kind of like assuming you need an innate magical ear for languages to speak French.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, people tell themselves they just don't have the gift for languages. But when you really break it down, you don't need magic. You just need to learn the grammar rules.
Right, mechanics.
You need to memorize the vocabulary,
Yeah.
understand how to conjugate verbs, and apply those frameworks consistently. You might not write award-winning French poetry, but you will be perfectly understood in Paris.
Because design is just visual grammar.
Exactly.
And if design is just visual grammar, we have to start with the absolute most foundational structural rule of that language.
Which is what?
The bedrock is what designers call visual hierarchy.
Oh, right. The breakdown we are looking at actually stays. And I love this. If you learn nothing else from this entire series, learn this.
So no pressure.
Right, no pressure at all. Let's dig into the mechanics of visual hierarchy. What is physically happening when a user opens a new page?
Well, at a biological level, visual hierarchy is simply the order in which the human optic nerve and brain process information on a screen. When someone lands on your dashboard, their eye does not read every single pixel sequentially from left to right, top to bottom. Not the way you'd read a paperback novel.
Right, because that would take forever.
Exactly. The human eye scans. It utilizes saccadic movements, which are these rapid jumps from one point of interest to another, seeking patterns and anchors to understand what it is even looking at.
So it's basically hunting for context.
Precisely. And it hunts based on very predictable triggers. The text actually has a brilliant analogy for this. Visual hierarchy is the design equivalent of structuring an API response.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, when you build an API, you don't just dump all the database rows into a flat, unordered string.
No, that would be a nightmare to parse.
Right, you structure a JSON payload. The parent object comes first, clearly labeled. The nested objects sit inside it. The metadata is pushed to the bottom.
So it has a clear architecture.
Exactly. You structure the data so the receiving system, the parser, can immediately extract the critical information. Visual hierarchy is building that exact same JSON structure, but the parser is the human eye.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We actually have the specific cues that the eye uses to parse that visual API.
Right, the actual triggers.
Yeah, they are size, color, contrast, position, and weight. The eye is biologically hardwired to notice the largest element on the page first.
Always.
And then the element with the highest contrast gets noticed second. A heavy, bold font naturally draws attention before a thin, light font. The top of the page naturally beats the bottom.
It is an entirely deterministic system.
Think about the classic layout of a newspaper front page. The architecture of a newspaper has been optimized for human scanning for centuries.
Ah, that's a great point.
The main headline is massive, thick, black ink.
Yeah.
You can read it from a newsstand 20 feet away.
Yep.
Then the subheadline is smaller, maybe italicized to create contrast, and the actual body text is tiny.
Right, because of the hierarchy.
Exactly. You, as the reader, instantly know what the editor considers the most important global event of the day before you have consciously read a single word. That hierarchy works perfectly, and it applies to every digital interface.
It really does.
But I need to push back on this a little bit because I know the exact trap an engineer falls into here. Let's say I am building an internal monitoring dashboard.
Okay, a dashboard.
From my perspective, as the system architect, literally everything on this dashboard is critical. The active user count is crucial. The server memory usage is crucial. The error logs are crucial.
Everything is a priority.
Right. If it wasn't crucial, I wouldn't have wasted a sprint building it into the UI in the first place. So my instinct is to make all those numbers massive. I want bold text, bright colors, huge widgets, because nobody can miss a server failure.
Right, which leads to a dashboard that looks like a chaotic warning label.
Exactly.
That is the fundamental trap analytical minds fall into. Because when you elevate everything, you elevate nothing.
Wow, yeah.
If every single element on your page is bold, size 24, and bright red, you have created a completely flat visual landscape.
It's kind of like writing a script where every single line is a comment in all caps.
Yes, it is visual screaming. Technically, all the data is present, just like your God class function technically compiles.
But nobody can read it.
Exactly. No human being can parse it quickly during a 3 a.m. outage because you have forced their brain to do all the heavy lifting. They have to figure out what actually matters in that specific second.
Right.
You haven't provided a hierarchy, you've just provided a data dump.
So to fix that flat landscape, we have to establish strict architectural levels.
Yeah. The foundational rule is that you need at least 3 distinct levels of hierarchy on any given page or component.
Okay, 3 levels.
Level 1 is your primary element. This is the single most important data point or the primary action you want the user to take.
So the biggest thing.
Right. It gets the most visual weight, the biggest size, the highest contrast. Then level 2 is your supporting information. This helps the user understand the context.
Like a subheadline.
Exactly. It's medium-sized, perhaps a lighter color like a dark gray instead of pure black.
And level 3 is the fine print.
Yep. Level 3 is your metadata. Timestamps, secondary navigation, auxiliary actions, units of measurement. This should be your smallest, lightest text.
So it's there if you need it.
Right. It is there when the user goes looking for it, but it does not demand their attention when they are just scanning the page.
And to verify if we've actually built those 3 levels correctly, there is this incredibly practical diagnostic tool from the source. It is called the squint test.
Oh, this is such a great trick.
If you're listening to this and you're currently working on a UI, I highly recommend trying this. You literally physically lean back from your monitor and squint your eyes until the screen becomes blurry. You are intentionally degrading your own vision.
Which forces your brain to stop reading the content and start reading the shapes.
Exactly. When you squint, the high-frequency details, like the actual words and numbers, they just disappear.
They wash out.
Yeah, and you are left with low-frequency information, just blobs of mass, color, and contrast. If your hierarchy is working, you should still be able to clearly identify the single most important element on that page.
Right.
A massive deploy button will still look like a prominent dark rectangle. A primary headline will still look like a heavy anchor at the top.
Yeah.
But if you squint and your entire dashboard blurs into a uniform, gray, muddy blob,
Then your hierarchy is broken.
yeah, completely broken.
It is a physical test for a visual rule. It strips away your emotional attachment to the data and forces you to see the page the way a new user's optic nerve sees it in the very first millisecond.
That is so true.
Which transitions us perfectly into the second major structural pillar. Because once you've established how to arrange your elements using size and weight, you inevitably run into the next problem.
Which it is.
What happens when all those carefully arranged elements are suffocating each other?
Oh, man. Which brings us to the concept of white space. And if you have an engineering-focused brain, this concept is going to actively fight against your deepest instincts.
It feels inherently wasteful.
It really does. Your entire career is based on optimization. You are trained to maximize resources, minimize latency, pack data efficiently.
Right, no wasted space.
That's exactly. When you look at a 27-inch monitor, unused screen real estate feels like unused server capacity. Leaving a massive chunk of the screen blank feels like, I don't know, paying for AWS instances you aren't even spinning up.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Your instinct is to pack it with as much data as humanly possible because empty space is doing nothing.
And that is the exact instinct we have to completely reprogram. Because white space, which is also referred to as negative space, is not empty.
It's not just a void.
No, it is not a blank void where you just forgot to put a database table. It is actually one of the most powerful, active structural components in your toolkit.
Okay, how so?
Doing nothing with pixels is actually doing an immense amount of work for the user's brain.
Because it serves 3 highly specific functions. Right, let's break those down.
Sure. First, white space creates breathing room, which directly translates to reducing cognitive load.
Making it easier to read.
Exactly. Reading a screen requires mental energy. When text and interactive elements are jammed tightly together, the eye struggles to track lines and identify clickable areas. It creates visual noise.
Right.
But by adding generous padding around an element, you are giving the optic nerve a resting place. You make the interface legible.
The second function is grouping. And this is where the engineering analogy gets really strong, I think. White space is basically the visual equivalent of the separation of concerns principle.
That is such a brilliant way to frame it.
Right.
If you have 2 microservices, you ensure they are decoupled. In a user interface, if you want the user to understand that the shipping address fields and the billing address fields are 2 distinct data sets, you don't necessarily need to draw a heavy black box around both of them.
You don't need literal lines.
No, you simply add a massive chunk of white space between them. The user's brain instantly processes the proximity. Elements that are close together are related. Elements separated by white space are distinct.
The empty space itself acts as the logical boundary. So what does this all mean for the overall feel of the product? That actually brings us to the third function. White space conveys quality and confidence.
Think about the stark difference between a Craigslist listing and an Apple product page.
Oh, night and day.
Craigslist is a pure exercise in data density. Every single square inch of the screen is packed with blue hyperlinks, tiny text, and thumbnail images. It is utilitarian to the extreme.
Very dense.
But when you land on an Apple page, there is a massive image of a phone, a short headline, and then just vast expanses of nothing but pure white or black background.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
What about something like a Bloomberg terminal for financial traders? Or a pilot's heads-up display?
Ah, right.
They pack 50 moving tickers, charts, and data streams onto one single screen. If I walk into a trading firm and double all the margins on their software, the traders will literally riot because they have to scroll to see their data. Does this white space rule really apply universally?
This raises a really important point about context. You are highlighting the difference between utilitarian density and consumer design.
Okay.
A Bloomberg terminal is designed for a highly trained expert who spends 8 hours a day parsing that specific density. But here's the secret. Even a Bloomberg terminal relies heavily on whitespace. It's just micro whitespace.
Micro whitespace.
Yeah, the alignment of the columns, the exact 2-pixel gap between the data rows. If you remove that tiny bit of white space, the terminal becomes entirely unusable.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. But for 99% of the interfaces we build, like internal tools, SaaS dashboards, mobile apps, our users are not trained analysts staring at the screen all day.
They're just regular people.
Exactly. They are distracted people trying to accomplish a quick task. For them, the Apple approach is far more effective. The white space basically screams, hey, we don't need to shout at you. We are confident in what we are showing you, and we are making it effortless for you to consume.
I really appreciate the musical analogy the source used to reinforce this.
It's a great analogy.
Think about white space like there's a silence in a piece of music. If a band just plays a continuous blaring wall of sound with no pauses, no rests, no dynamic shifts,
It's just exhausting.
it's unlistenable noise. The brief moments of silence between the notes are what actually give the music its rhythm and groove.
Right.
The silence creates the emotional impact. The negative space between the components on your web page is doing the exact same structural work. It is the silence that allows your actual data to be heard.
It is the architectural support column for your content. So the question really becomes, how do we systematically apply this when our default setting is to just cram everything together?
There is a very practical, almost mechanical rule of thumb provided in the text for analytical minds. If you're building a layout, you probably rely on standard spacing. 12 pixels of padding, maybe 16 pixels of margin if you're feeling really generous.
Right. Everything is cozy and compact.
Highly optimized.
Yes. So the actionable rule is try doubling it.
Just blindly.
Just blindly take your 12-pixel margin and change it to 24 pixels. Take your 16 pixels of padding inside your buttons and make it 32. And then once you've done that, try doubling it again.
Wait, go all the way to 48 or 64 pixels of empty space? It feels like you're breaking the CSS.
I know, it will feel deeply uncomfortable at first, but you will be absolutely shocked at how much cleaner, more modern, and more professional your interface looks when you just force the elements to spread out.
By adding space.
Yeah. And while professional designers use specific mathematical grid systems like 4-point or 8-point spacing systems, which we can definitely explore in the future, the foundational mantra you have to adopt today is simply, when in doubt, add more space.
Let's bring all of this together. The core takeaway from today's deep dive is a fundamental shift in mindset. Design is not a mystical aura. It is visual grammar.
Exactly.
By taking your chaotic UI and restructuring it like an API response with clear hierarchical levels of size and contrast, and by rigorously utilizing the squint test to ensure your primary elements survive the blur.
And by actively fighting your engineer's instinct to pack the screen, deliberately doubling your margins, and using whitespace as a structural tool to group related logic and reduce cognitive load.
You can immediately elevate your next side project, your team's internal dashboard, or your startup's landing page. You basically transition from an amateur wall of logic to a polished professional interface.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, hierarchy and whitespace are really just the first two foundational steps. There are other principles mentioned in our source like alignment, proximity, and contrast that are the next logical steps to master.
They all build on each other.
Right. Together, they form a complete systematic vocabulary.
It really is just a finite set of repeatable logical rules. But analyzing it this way leaves me with a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
We've established that design isn't art. It's just a handful of learnable frameworks. But if that is entirely true, it raises a fascinating question. At what point does perfectly applied logic become indistinguishable from human creativity?
That is a great question.
Right. If we build an AI and we train it to perfectly execute all 15 of these rules, flawless visual hierarchy, mathematically perfect white space, optimal color contrast, will its output actually possess that elusive quality we call taste?
Or is it just following instructions?
Exactly.
Right.
Despite perfectly following all the grammar rules, is there still an unquantifiable ghost in the machine? Something in the messy, subjective nature of human creativity that rigid rules can never quite capture. Something to think about the next time you're staring at a brilliantly architected backend, wondering why the front end still feels just a little bit off. Because until that AI masters taste, that front end is still up to you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.